with the announcement of Kivi's second pregnancy, and the base already getting a little crowded. The colony decided to carve out some of the mountain adjacent to their base. The plan was to utilise the resources that dwelled within, whilst also using the space to expand their sprawling colony. The colony was short on various raw resources, iron and coal especially. They needed these to start production of steel, something they would need a lot of going forward. But despite the cold outside and the dirt that covered their floors, moods in the base were surprisingly high, and life trundled on at a steady pace. And whilst winter generally turned the landscape bleak and desolate, the migration of two giant and strange alien life forms made the colony curious. But with one look at these animals, it was clear that they were not to be trifled with. After getting enough steel together, Aliona finally put together the colony's first lathe, something that they had needed for a very long time. Using this, they could convert raw resources into components directly, something they'd only been able to acquire through scavenging until now. This would pave the way for the colony to expand and progress, allowing them to use higher tech, study more difficult research, and hopefully finally build a radio and receiver, in the hope of contacting someone or finding a way off this planet. With the extra components, they were able to build an electric stove, something that would allow the colony to cook and prepare many varied types of food that they'd been unable to make, using the portable kitchen that they'd been using until now. Despite this, they decided to keep the portable kitchen. If and when they decided to travel again, it would be an extremely useful tool to have with them. With the extra components, they could also finally build refrigerators, enabling them to preserve their food and make sure that they never had food issues again. But life in the colony wasn't perfect. The biofuel refinery, short-circuiting for being exposed to the outside elements, almost set fire to their fuel reserves, which, if left unchecked, would have likely turned the entire colony into one giant fireball. Thankfully, however, they were able to put it out in time and learned going forward that they had to roof over their electrics. Then there was a case of flu where Ash and Kepe almost succumbed to the illness. Thankfully, both were able to pull through, and through fighting the deadly illness, Kepe, after self-reflection, realised he had to become more hygienic and organised as to avoid risk for infection in the future. It was at this point that Aliona went under the knife to try and install a hook hand after her hand had to be amputated off to save her from a fungal infection. Unfortunately, due to their lack of medicine, Reginald failed to install a hook hand. This was disheartening. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only bad news. A ship chunk crashed nearby to the base. It sent a psychic pulse through all females of the colony. The debris had also contained strange mechanoids, some which seemed designed for medical care, and others that seemed more equipped for war and destruction. Kivi, however, had a plan. Opened fire on the strange ship chunk, waking the mechanoids that lay dormant nearby. As soon as they woke and started moving towards her, she fired at the fungal ship chunk. Once doing so, a single fungoid escaped the capsule. Kivi's hope was that these two enemies would fight each other, and at least one enemy would be taken out this way. She then bolted as quick as she could, back to the safety behind the wall. Her plan worked though. Brutus, however, wasn't as quick as Kivi, and was seized upon, leaving him a bloody mess on the floor. Thankfully, these strange mechanoids left him on the ground, content to trundle back to the crash site, where the smaller mechanoids fixed the damage done to them. This gave Kivi time to rescue Brutus before he bled out, but the warlike mechanoids weren't far behind her. As soon as Kivi got in the door, one of these mechanoids, that they dubbed a Scyther, managed to cut her before the door could shut. Kivi dropped Brutus instinctively, but thankfully, after they banged on the door a few times, they gave up, seemingly more concerned with protecting the ship chunk than anything else. Thankfully, Kivi wasn't that injured, and Reginald was able to patch Brutus up fairly quickly. Neither of them were going to die today. However, the planet didn't seem to let up, and the following morning, they were attacked once again by giant black insects. Strangely, however, these didn't seem to target the base as before, apart from one who seemed hell-bent on destroying their water pump. No, these mammoth-like insects went straight for the mechanoids. Maybe there was some history between the two species, none of them knew. But whatever the case, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the colony watched as the two monstrosities battled each other out, something that could only benefit the colony. After a lengthy battle, unfortunately the mechanoids won, losing only a single Scyther unit, with the other two suffering heavy blows. After unleashing its anger on the water pump, the final insect made its way to attack the mechanoids. This resulted in a lengthy battle between the two, but suddenly, something unexpected happened. A third party appeared. one that the colony had never seen before. The insect stood no chance, and then it was the Scyther against this strange, thin, misshapen humanoid. It was quickly apparent this strange humanoid was incredibly weak, and went down after only a few hits. And whilst this strange creature lay bleeding out, the mechanoids went back to the ship chunk, fixing themselves up, ready for the next fight. Agent, realizing time was of the essence, rushed down, and he quickly fired off as many shots as he could at the mechanoids, whilst they were busy repairing themselves. Running back and forth, avoiding the smaller mechanoids, he managed to kill quite a few of them, as these smaller mechanoids seemed more intent on fixing themselves than dealing with Agent as a threat. However, after a missed shot at one of the Scyther, they seemed to come to and chased Agent down. Thankfully, Agent managed to get back behind the door before they caught up to him, and once again after a few hits on the door, left back to their ship chunk. Agent then used the opportunity to once again go back and forth, repeating this process. The next time, however, he wasn't so lucky, and although he did take out a Scyther in the end, for the privilege of doing so, took a number of hits himself. Aliona, as a last crack shot uninjured, decided to take it upon herself to finish the job that Kivy and Agent started, and in doing so was able to take out the final Scyther, feeling extremely smug in the process. She went to inspect the strange humanoid that had also appeared, but before she could get to it, it let out a strange scream and died before she could investigate further. She then proceeded to take out the remaining mechanoids one after another, until all of them were defeated. Once this was done, she took out both the mechanoid ship chunk and also the one that the fungoid had come out of. The following day, and the colony were optimistic. They got back to their day-to-day jobs and thought that the threat had been subdued. However, their complacency was put in check once they heard more screams, similar to that of the humanoid. Another one was outside the walls, chasing Reginald down. Reginald knew that he couldn't escape it, and so turned to face it, wielding his knife. Reginald thought he had a chance. However, a second of these creatures appeared out the shadows, taking him out in the process. By now, the group had managed to get outside the walls and gunned the creatures down. They took out the two that had downed Reginald, but not before a third also emerged from the shadows, launching itself at Buck before she could retaliate. Thankfully, she wasn't injured that badly, and after they recovered quickly to go and get Reginald, they could hear screaming of these strange creatures in the far-off distance. They feared that more of these creatures were yet to come, so they grabbed Reginald and ran back to the safety of the walls, hoping to avoid a further attack. Buck then patched Reginald up. Thankfully, he would pull through, but it was a closer call than they would have liked. These creatures were clearly not something to be messed with. The colony had survived a number of attacks, but they were tired, injured. They prayed for a respite. There were still a number of jobs they hadn't been able to get done over the winter. There was a lot of work that needed doing, and these constant attacks were slowing them down. Still, it could have been worse. They had meat and chitin from the large black insects, and Reginald and Buck would recover without issue. They also had more bovine beetles than ever before, with plenty of milk and eggs coming in on a daily basis. Despite the constant threats, the colony was thriving. It was also clear after the last attack that their water pump was inadequately defended. They knew that there was another water source that was technically closer to their base, and so they constructed a wall around this other water source, hoping to contain it within their walls. Whilst Aliona was out trying to build this wall, however, she let her guard down, and a few of the strange humanoid creatures appeared out of thin air. Aliona fled as quick as she could. However, a third creature appeared in front of her eyes, blocking her path. She managed to maneuver around it, taking it out before it could get close. She then fired off shots behind her as she fled towards the entrance, taking a few more out in the process, but more and more kept appearing to pursue her. She knew she wouldn't be able to get into the base without risking injury, and so she decided to stand her ground, running back on herself, shooting as she went. And despite more and more creatures constantly appearing, she managed to whittle their numbers down, until she had managed to kill or down all that were coming for her. Aliona didn't waste a breath in running back to these downed creatures, and finishing them off one by one. She wouldn't give these creatures time to scream for backup. And while some of the colony began researching beer brewing, the rest of them, including Buck and Kivy, started burying these strange humanoids, hoping that in doing so, more wouldn't come to find them. After they dealt with the threat of these strange humanoids, Aliona moved the pump to a different position, and then proceeded to construct a wall around it, hoping that the wall would protect it from any future attacks. With Ash becoming a toddler, she'd gained more independence, and gave herself the nickname Prissy. But as she'd grown older, the colony realised that they needed to start her schooling, and so constructed a rudimentary school that they could use to teach her about the ways of the world, and help her become a better member of the colony going forward. After finishing their research on beer brewing, they decided to double down on their food preservation. Being able to turn their milk from the bovine beetles into cheese would be extremely beneficial to the colony. But whilst once again everything in the colony seemed to be getting back to normal, a strange transport pod came crashing through the sky. This time it wasn't a human, but an animal, in which a strange glowing creature, which they nicknamed a netch, came out. They had seen something like this in the far-off distance of the Ashlands, a creature almost like a jellyfish, which used a gas they produced to float through the air, which they could harvest a jelly-like substance from it, which they could use as food. Buck took charge of this creature. As somewhat of an outcast herself, she felt sympathy towards this creature, patched it up herself in the hopes of forming a bond with it. In doing so, the creature decided to stay and became a permanent member of the colony. Finally, after many weeks, the room containing the biofuel refinery and the generator was finished. They decided to split the room in half, one half containing these machines, the other they would turn into a dedicated hospital, something the colony was lacking and desperately needed. They also built an additional room onto the biofuel refinery room. This, once they had finished the research, would become a room dedicated to cheese production. They had a huge amount of milk coming into the colony, and so they needed a dedicated room to house all of the cheese presses. With the hospital finished, Reginald once again attempted to operate on Aliona to give her a replacement for a hand. This time it was successful, and Reginald managed to install a wooden hand onto her. It was nowhere near as efficient as her original hand, but it was much better than nothing. Life in the colony was seemingly getting back on track. Winter was coming to an end, and everything was looking up, and it was at this point that Kivy went into labour. Reginald ran into her bedroom to rescue her, picking her up off the ground and taking her into the new hospital. And once there, he helped deliver Kivy's baby, with Agent standing aside, excited and nervous to become a parent for the second time. Thankfully, the baby was born healthy, a little girl, which they decided to name Kiko. But, like when Ash was born, she worried for her future, worried about the fact that she might grow up on this planet without ever seeing their home world. With renewed determination to escape this planet, after finishing their research into cheese making, they decided to finally put their efforts into researching a working transmitter and receiver. If they could research how to build an antenna tower and a radio terminal, they might be able to receive a signal from a passing ship, or perhaps even the remnants of the Hermes. If they were lucky, some of its systems might still be intact, and the ship's AI might be able to land somewhere on the planet, allowing them to escape. And so, whilst Kivy played with Kiko, basking in the happiness that came with her new baby, Agent busied himself with researching, hoping that he would be able to research a working radio and antenna tower in order to get his family off planet. During this blissful morning, Kivy decided once and for all it was time to give the original bovine beetles names. She named the original bull Rocky, and the two cows Fifi and Nika. The bovine beetles have been pivotal to their survival on this planet, and they had been with them since the very beginning. They deserved to be treated as equals. During this brief respite from all the chaos, injuries, battles, and blood, the crew enjoyed a peaceful 5 minutes. Kivy nursing her new baby, Prissy running around the living room kitchen, enjoying herself, and her newfound freedom as a young child, able to move about on her own. Buck was even sociable, talking to Prissy and Kivy long into the day. It was easy to forget in these moments just how hostile the planet actually was. It wasn't long before Aliona put the finishing touches to her prototype radio receiver, and also started work on the antenna transmitter just outside the base. The newfound invention of stew also gave a much needed boost to the colony. No longer would they have to endure the horrible texture of the insect meat. Now, with the knowledge of how to cook it properly, the team could actually eat their insect meat without it souring their mood. But with their increased population and their extra seeds for crops, they decided to build a third greenhouse, which would house their soybeans and strawberries that they had been keeping safe all this time. Finally, Aliona put the finishing touches to the prototype antenna tower, and after Reginald got it working properly, they were all eager to turn it on, hoping and praying that this was the beginning of the end for them. Now they just needed to play a message on a loop and transmit it out into the world. Yes, this was a risk, but it was a risk worth taking. With this in place, it was now just a waiting game to see who would receive their message, or if they would receive a message in turn. With the first crop of strawberries and soybeans now in place, the team decided to build a secondary fridge. They needed to make sure for winter that they would be able to preserve any and all food that was coming in for the colony. And it wasn't long before Aliona put the finishing touches to the bone wall. securing the pond within the perimeter walls. The team set up fishing zones and also a bathing zone, so that during the summer, the team could relax, splash around, and actually enjoy the outside, something that they were rarely able to do. On the subject of bathing, the colony decided that they needed to expand. Their one toilet was no longer sustainable for such a large colony. They set up 2 dedicated toilets, as well as showers. They had been washing themselves out of buckets and sinks for too long, and they deserved some luxury in their lives. With an electric boiler, thermostat and water storage, they finally had access to hot water. Now, for the first time in years, they could enjoy a hot shower and feel properly clean once again. But the good times couldn't last for long, and a psychic ship chunk crashed nearby, thankfully only releasing a few mechanoids. After finally finishing their research on radio transmitters and receivers, they decided to double down on advanced Ashland survival. They anticipated they'd be travelling through the Ashlands again soon, and they needed to get all the research they could under their belt before they pushed further into the wilderness. This research unlocked a variety of teas using the local flora. These teas offered various benefits, including a resistance to ash buildup, something that was sure to benefit their future journey. Now that the colony knew how the mechanoids worked, they decided to place wooden traps nearby, instead of simply facing them head-on. They hoped these traps would deal some damage before they managed to get into melee range. Unfortunately, a mass wildfire dashed their plans somewhat, and although the rains did eventually come to put out the fires, it also brought forth a heatwave, making the base uncomfortably hot and souring the moods of everyone. But after the psychic droner amplified, they decided it was time to try and take out the mechanoids. They lined up behind the recently replaced traps and opened fire on the Scyther. The wooden traps unfortunately did very little to slow the Scyther down, and because of this, Aliona took a number of hits. Kepe used a riot shield to try and hold them back, but sadly he was down too. The colony had to keep falling back, trying to shoot the mechanoids as they ran. But thankfully, their pet electric eel distracted the last Scyther long enough for Agent and Kivy to give it the finishing blow. With their perimeters secure once again, they hauled Aliona back to base to patch her up. Kepe was in more critical condition, so Reginald had to perform first aid right there and then on the blood-soaked floor, whilst Agent took it upon himself to destroy the psychic ship chunk to make all their lives more bearable. Thankfully, both Kepe and Aliona would pull through. Neither of them suffered any major damage, and with their newly constructed hospital, the risk of infection was minimal. With the mechanoids once again defeated, life continued at a steady pace, with Reginald focusing on making more components. With their research becoming more and more advanced, they knew they would need all the components they could get going forward. Then strangely, out the blue, a human approached the base, someone that none of them recognized, an Rimworld entrepreneur. The colony found his story strange, but saw no reason to reject his proposal to join their colony, and so they accepted him with open arms, thankful to have another member on their team. Stites proved a useful member of the colony, but it wasn't long before the colony was tested once again, with a huge black hive insect attack, which was stampeding towards the base. This was the biggest battle the colony had ever faced. They were all nervous. They ordered Prissy to go and protect Kiko, praying that the insects wouldn't break in. But suddenly, something unexpected happened. Stites transformed, his skin and flesh falling in chunks around him. A monstrous humanoid creature emerged from the gory husk. What the creature's initial intentions were was unknown, but at this moment it seemed hellbent on attacking Agent and the other colonists. With a few lucky shots, the creature was quickly taken out. What the creature was would forever be unknown. Was Stites ever a real person? Was this just some sort of mime, copying their behaviour and hoping to integrate themselves into their society? They would never know, but for now they had bigger fish to fry. Now it was the Black Hive's turn to attack, but when it was clear that these insects had split up, surrounding the base, they hurried back to the safety behind the walls. However, it was clear that the insects had already breached the walls. As quickly as they could, they tried to kill the first mammoth worm, and after intense gunfire and a bloody few seconds, the mammoth worm collapsed to the ground. This was only one of about a dozen though, as the other insects started to advance, rushing through the holes they made in the wall. They retreated back to the safety of the newly established pond. They hoped to use the remaining mountain to act as a funnel, making the enemy numbers count for nothing. As they approached the pond, a mammoth worm anticipated their move. The colony ran, retreating around the pond as fast as they could, attempting to slow the worm down in the mud. But thankfully the plan worked, and the mammoth worm collapsed. A number of the insects were attempting to breach into their living quarters, and fearing for Kivi and Kiko's lives, the colonists rushed down, trying to take out the insects as quickly as they could. Brutus stood no chance against the mammoth worm, but he acted as a good distraction, allowing the colony to gun the worm down. They quickly rushed to finish off the rest of the insects, which had a ranged attack. Kepe with his riot shield ran in, attempting to take their hits and get them into melee range. The plan worked, but in doing so, Kepe was downed, heavily injured. However, his sacrifice had been worth it. The colony was safe without suffering any permanent damage. At least half the colony was severely injured and needed urgent medical treatment. Reginald, as the best medic, did the best he could, but unfortunately he himself was so injured, he collapsed on the way to getting medicine. It was now up to Kivi and Buck to try and give the rest of the colony first aid. Neither of them were particularly sufficient, but they did their best, hoping that they would get everyone to pull through. But Brutus's condition wasn't looking good, as he lay in a pool of blood in the makeshift classroom. The sad truth was that Kivi and Buck had to prioritize human life over their pets. By some miracle, Kivi and Buck managed to treat all of the colonists before any of them bled out. Kivi desperately tried to patch Brutus up, and thankfully she was just in time to do so. Unfortunately, Buck developed an infection in her leg. It was only to be expected from all the blood and dirt that was inside the base as a result of the attack. But honestly, the colony was simply thankful that everyone was alive. Kivi patched Buck up as best she could, but with the hospital's walls breached, and Kivi herself not skilled in first aid, she didn't do a very good job of treating her. And to add salt to the wound, sudden freakishly strong winds assaulted the colony and the surrounding area, bringing sand and ash from nearby desert, turning once luscious green plains into a desert, and turning their hospital into a sandpit. All of this put together meant that Buck's infection got worse and worse, and it was touch and go as to whether she would survive it. Reginald, only just got up from the injuries himself, treated her as best he could. It wasn't his best work, but they hoped and prayed it would be enough to keep Buck alive. Thankfully, Buck did pull through. The shock to her system led her to become psychically deaf, something that they hoped could actually prove useful to the colony in the future. The colony had survived harsh winters. They had advanced technologically, expanded their base, gained new luxuries, survived countless assaults, from horrific monsters to giant insects. Their base was buried in sands, littered with holes, and smothered in blood. But it was still standing. They were all alive, and now was the time to recover, rebuild, and make the best of the situation that they were in. But they all hoped and prayed, with their radio system now in place, it wouldn't be long before they could leave their home behind and push forward to a brighter future. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you've liked what I've said, please leave a like and subscribe. A massive thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube members: Clint, David, Valise, Lorby Lord, T Chaos, Tallman, Nacho Cheese, King of Thorns, Charles, Latz, Brian, Heretic, and PWR Wolf. Cheers, guys, you're all amazing. Thank you so much for all your support. See you next episode. Bye-bye.